with you, my friend. We're hoping that there will be a wonderful lecture, and we will be able to explore more how we can collaborate with you on the V-Dem project, which I have been following for a number of years. But I wanted a more institutional collaboration because I really consider that your effort is the largest and most sophisticated and most serious effort at tackling the issue of democracy around the world, and to do so in a scientific and quantitative fashion whenever possible. Qualitative is also needed, of course, but at least to bring some rigor and discipline to the exercise rather than simply general statements. And I was very intrigued by that.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks for inviting us to be here today. As you said, to formalize what has so far been an informal collaboration. It's my sincere pleasure to be here today, and starting just from where you ended, I would like to emphasize how much we are enthusiastic, not only me personally, but all the staff and researchers at the V-Dem Institute at University of Gothenburg, and the wider group of scholars and researchers associated with Varieties of Democracy and V-Dem.
صباح الخير والسلام عليكم جميعا، ومرحبا بكم في هذا اللقاء. اللقاء بعد شوية هيبقى باللغة الإنجليزية، إنما أنا حرصت أن أشرح لكم أهمية هذا اللقاء وأهمية الضيف اللي عندنا النهاردة عشان تبقوا مقدرين إيه اللي بنعمله. إحنا بهذه المناسبة مع وجود الضيف معنا النهاردة وقعنا اتفاقية تعاون بيننا وبين المؤسسة اللي هو يرأسها ويمثلها، وهي مؤسسة اسمها باختصار V-Dem، حرف V ودم اللي هي اختصار ل Varieties of Democracy، اللي هي التعددية في الديمقراطية. فاحنا كلنا نعلم ان في أنظمة برلمانية وفي أنظمة رئاسية وفي أنظمة فيها مجلس شيوخ ومجلس نواب، في أنظمة لها مجلس نواب فقط، في أنظمة فيدرالية، في أنظمة أحادية، ففي حاجات كتيرة جدا مختلفة في العالم. هذا المشروع أكبر مشروع من نوعه في العالم وبمراحل، وأكبر مشروع في دراسة علمية، بركز على كلمة علمية، مش مجرد مقالات سياسية بتاخد موقف مع وضد، إنما دراسات علمية لهذا الموضوع. فبدأوا إنهم يحددوا مؤشرات للدول المختلفة، زي نسبة المشاركة في التصويت، زي مؤشرات بهذا النوع. في حاليا المشروع ده تقريبا 400 مؤشر لكل دولة. ال 400 مؤشر دول بياخدوهم ويبنوا بيهم مؤشرات طبعا أكثر تركيبا، إنما ال 400 مؤشر والمعلومات موجودة عندهم على 174 دولة، ولفترة زمنية طبعا تختلف على حسب الدول، إنما من أقدمهم بداية القرن العشرين، يعني في من 1910 1915 لغاية دلوقتي، وفي طبعا حاجات أحدث، يعني دول أحدث. من دول بروفيسور ليندبرج بيقول لي إنه في حاليا 88 دولة، بروفايلز بتاعت 88 دولة ممكن تشوفوها أونلاين، وإنه في فترة زمنية وجيزة، shall we say next month would be 120، في إبريل إن شاء الله هيبقى في 120 من الدول دي المعلومات موجودة أونلاين للي عايز يدرسها ويشوفها. طبعا دي أكبر دراسة من نوعها في العالم، وان احنا دلوقتي هنبقى شركاء معاهم في هذه الدراسه، في التحليل وفي القيام بدراسات وبتاع. مش بس ان احنا هندرس الحاجات دي او نطبقها على بلدنا، لا، انا بتكلم على دراستنا لكل مناطق العالم، مش حتى محصورين في منطقه واحده. دي شراكه مفتوحه بين مكتبه اسكندريه وبينهم على حجم هذا الموضوع. الزملاء اللي ورا واللي واقفين ورا، في كراسي هنا قدام اهو، اتفضلوا. في 1 2 3 4 5 كراسي هنا، وفي هناك اهو كرسي هناك كمان اهو، وفي هنا قدام. اتفضل اتفضل يا عماد. هنا قدام اهو عندي. طب خلاص، المكان جنب منى كويس. فهيبقى الحاجات دي كلها موجوده. فطبعا استغلينا فرصه ان هو موجود في المكتبه النهارده، وفرصه انكم تسمعوا منه. وتفضل مشكورا انه يشاركنا في شيء من المعرفه على قيادته لهذه الدراسه العالميه اللي ببساطه جدا ملهاش مثيل. يعني مفيش اي دراسه اخرى تقارن بهذا الحجم والسعه والعمق والمتابعه التاريخيه والانضباط العلمي زي الدراسه دي. وهي بتقاد من معهدين، المعهد الاول اللي هو في السويد في جوتنبرج، مطرح ما زرته في ديسمبر، وبعد كده الجزء الثاني في مركز ثاني في الولايات المتحده، وان شاء الله احنا نبقى مركز ثالث ومركز رابع في اماكن اخرى لدراسه هذا الموضوع. فدكتور مصطفى فهمي، اتفضل يا فندم. في كراسي هنا، كرسي قدامه، اتفضل يا فندم. اتفضل. السفير علي ماهر هنا. حد منكم يمكن رجع اوديهم كرسيين هنا. اتفضل 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 يا دكتور مصطفى. اتفضل. فعلى اي حال، انا كنت حريص ان انتوا تعرفوا عشان كده مني انا التقديم الاولي ده. ويعني it gives me very great pleasure to welcome to the Library of Alexandria Professor Staffan Lindberg, the head of the V-Dem Institute and professor at the University of Gothenburg, and Wallenberg Academy Fellow, and who will now present to us something about the V-Dem project that I've just given you a very brief outline of. Professor Lindberg.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Sarah Geldin. And it's a pleasure to be here today at Bibliotheca Alexandria to talk to you about V-Dem. Varieties of Democracy, under this title, has research on democracy been misinformed for 50 years. And that's a reference to that we have in the academic community been doing research on democracy and democratization for at least 50 years. We can debate the exact time frame, it doesn't matter. Without really having the data and the tools that we need available. And the V-Dem project is an effort to change that. So in about 40 minutes, I will try and give you a broad overview of the goals with the V-Dem project, and how we go about it, and then give you some illustrations of a couple of issues when it comes to democracy and democratization, and how using V-Dem data as compared to other sources give you a different picture of the world, different picture of different regions and individual countries. So it's a very broad introduction that will cover a lot of things. And I hope I won't go too fast through all of this. But if I do, and if it's completely incomprehensible at a point, just make me aware of it, and you can ask your question. Okay, so what are the goals for the V-Dem project? Well, we have been studying many different things in relation to democracy. There are all these traditions about, for example, the consistent finding that democracies don't fight wars with each other. Their relationship with civil war, with quality of life, with group and gender equality, and all these kinds of things, not at least economic development, which has been in a big debate over 50 years whether democracy leads to better socioeconomic development, or whether you need socioeconomic development first and then eventually you get democracy, perhaps. Of course, in this country and in this region, the democracy scholars across the world quickly went to analyze this Arab Spring and making all kinds of comparisons with the colored revolutions that occurred earlier in Eastern Europe and former post-communist countries. This is also important from a policy point of view. At least 13 billion US dollars are spent every year on democracy support, human rights, good governance, and those kinds of things. But because research has been in some ways misinformed by not having adequate data available, we as academics, as analysts, as intellectuals have not been able to advise the policy community on actually how to go about supporting democracy. When different international organizations, when NGOs, international or national, when donors of different kinds try to support democracy in this country or in other countries where there is still a lot of work to be done, we operate on hunches and intuitions and some tentative findings from academic research. Then you have these fundamental issues. There is no consensus about what democracy is or should be, ought to be. There are different ideas about that. And this is an issue I will come back to in a few seconds. What do we have to study democracy is this. Institutes like Freedom House, measuring political rights and civil liberties across the world, but relatively short time series from 1974. And it's, as you probably know, it's a US State Department funded operation. And if there's one thing we know is that there are sometimes political considerations that goes into how they measure these things for different countries. Hence, as academics and for real analysis, we cannot always trust it. Polity4, which is a CIA-funded operation, and a lot of academics use it because it has this longest time series and is consistently coded across time for many countries. It's a scale that runs from -10 to +10, yeah, I won't go into the details. Then you have this measure that some scholars use, but it's a dichotomous measure. So it's only you're a non-democracy, if you like, or a democracy. There's nothing in between. No shades of gray, no nothing. So you can imagine the nuance in the type of analysis you can do is not very great. And then you have some of these other newer measures with even shorter timescales. There are many problems with these. But this lecture will not go into all these problems. I'll just come back to this issue with what democracy is. So in terms of different ideas about what democracy is, the only thing that sort of unites everybody is that it's ruled by the people, the literal meaning of the word. But how that rule of the people over itself should be implemented, and what's important for it to work, and what does it mean that the people should rule? Is it only that once every 4 or 5 years you cast a vote? And in Soviet Union in those times, there was only one party to vote for, right? Is that enough? Is that ruled by the people? Well, according to them at that point it was, right? But that's the only thing that unites us in terms of that. But the measures that we have had so far, in principle the Freedom House and Polity, but also the Jaworski measure and the others, focus on a very narrow part of what democracy is. Only things that have to do with the elections, basically. A little bit of civil liberties with Freedom House, but not much. And when it comes to the electoral part of democracy, if you like, a measure like polity only requires, for example, that 40% of the population, voting age population, have the right to vote. So women don't count, right? Sweden became a perfect democracy in 1917. That was before women had the right to vote. But it became a perfect democracy. That it needs to be a little bit of competition in the elections, but very little, and a little bit of constraints on executive power with a judiciary that can occasionally rule against the executive, things like that. But it's very, very narrow. So the bar for becoming a democracy is very low with the polity measure. And it's also not capturing all other things that we can think of as democracy. So it looks like this. When we think about democracy at the national level, the electoral part, or electoral democracy, if you like, is a necessary component. That's why we put it in the middle here. If nothing else, for mathematical reasons, right? If you have 90 million people, they cannot always be part of every little decision, right? We need representatives who deal with this on an everyday basis, so we can go about our work, teaching, or being students, or directors, or whatever it is. So we need to have elections where we can elect representatives, and then, as the saying goes, if we don't like what they're doing, throw the rascals out. Right? So there needs to be choice in elections. There needs to be 2 or more parties. And there needs to be freedom to form political parties. If you don't agree with any of the political parties, you want to form your own and run in elections, that should be free. And it should be free for men and women, and so on and so forth. And there needs to be information about what these parties, what they say, what they want to do, what they actually do when they are in office. So there needs to be, freedom of media and alternative sources of information, and freedom of association. So you can also have civil society holding the parties to account. That's essentially the core of democracy. Voting rights, party rights, election rights, free and fair elections, those kinds of things. And the existing indices today sort of measure a portion of that, and a little bit of the liberal in Freedom House case. So there are these other sort of ways of thinking about democracy, and you can think of them as critiques of electoral only, saying electoral the part of democracy is necessary, but it's not enough. We need something else. So the liberal version, which, think United States, that's sort of the most extreme country in emphasizing perhaps the liberal, saying that the elections can lead to the tyranny of the majority, starting to infringe on individual liberties. In the US, the right to own guns and things like that, right? And carry it around in Texas. So we need to constrain the executive by having separation of powers, an executive with its own elections, a legislature, and a strong judiciary, a strong Supreme Court that has a political role, in order to protect the civil liberties, individual rights, and also minority rights. So they emphasize that value of individual rights very strongly. That's very different from, for example, the egalitarian tradition, saying electoral democracy is not enough, it's good, but it's not enough. And think countries like where I come from in Northern Europe are much more inspired by this tradition, saying that, okay, electoral democracy is fine, but we know that all the political rights that come with electoral democracy are affected by other things. So even if we all have the right to vote, if people with lower education, less socioeconomic protection, less access to health, don't vote because of these things, then they de facto, in reality, they don't have the right to vote, or they have it to a lower degree. And the voting is the most equal right in democracy, but it's still affected by these things. Then when it comes to forming a political party, voicing your opinion in the media, and all these kinds of more demanding activities as citizens in a democracy, then they are even more structured by that. And the example I used to tease the Americans with was if you don't have the access to healthcare, then you have a higher probability of dying. And if you die, you can't vote, right? Well, actually, I've been studying Africa, sub-Saharan Africa for many years, and there are a lot of dead people voting in some of those elections, but that's a different thing. So, what we're saying, the egalitarian tradition therefore says, we need to have equal access to good quality education for everyone, for them to be able to exercise their political rights in equal measure. You need some socioeconomic protection so that not poor people dependent on somebody else will vote like that person tells you to vote, because otherwise you will lose your livelihood. We need access to good health care for everybody so that people don't die or end up in hospital and so on, and then they can't exercise their political rights. So here you see other values are emphasized in the liberal tradition. And without going through sort of the other versions in detail, the consensual tradition is about that all significant groups in society should have a voice, and so they have a stake in the political system. And in the extreme version, you have these examples of in South Africa after the transition from apartheid, then the white minorities, they were safeguarded, they were automatically given some seats in government so that they wouldn't be thrown out and completely marginalized immediately after the end of apartheid. So these allocation of political power to some extent to all political groups. But at least things like proportional representation in parliament, so even small groups can have their MP in parliament and voice their opinion. Majoritarian tradition, just to pick another one, it's very different from the liberal, and this is the UK, Britain very inspired by this, or sort of been carrying this model in practice for many years. There, the value is that if the rule by the people should be real, then the people's representatives must be able to issue policy. So it must be a strong executive. Strong executive instead of a weak one, right? So you want parliamentary system with single-member districts so that you always get one party with a majority of seats in parliament. So when the prime minister brings a bill to parliament, it will always pass. Then the people's representative is ruling, right? Instead of, as in the US right now, President Obama can't do much because he doesn't have a majority in the legislature, and so they are at conflict all the time and nothing happens. Stalemate. So, whereas the existing measures of democracy have been sort of measuring a very narrow slice of all these ideas about what democracy is or could be, we have set out to measure all things. Everything. So instead of measuring democracy as one thing, it's at least 7. And each of them we break down in their component parts. So, you know, when I talk about liberal, for example, the separation of power or the strong judiciary, those components. And for each component we measure with many indicators. So these 7 as a whole are measured with 329 indicators. And in the V-Dem project, we measure democracy beyond also these 7 a little bit, so it's over 400 indicators. 400 indicators of democracy, that's not very important. 400 indicators of democracy, all countries in the world, from 1900 to 2012. What are some of the challenges when we do this? Well, some of the things that we want to know about democracy are very ambiguous. If we want to measure it with factual data, some people like factual data only, right? Things that we can take, we can hold on to, and we know. How many parties ran in the elections? How many parties, were any parties banned by legislation? So on. But there are some things that are ambiguous. My favorite example is, even with electoral democracy, we need alternative sources of information about both parties and what happens. What do we need for that? We need a free media. What do we need for a free media? One of the indicators of that is that if a journalist writes something critical about the government, have you ever heard that happen? So they are not being harassed or thrown into jail, right? That's sometimes controversial. But that's a key indicator. Now, we could count, in any country in the world, we could count the number of journalists being thrown into jail or harassed every year because they write something critically about the government. What's the problem with that? The problem is that it's zero often in countries like Sweden and others, where I come from. But it's also zero in North Korea. Because in North Korea, nobody dares to stick out their neck. Right? You will be foolish because you will die. Right? So, and also an increase in the number of journalists being thrown into jail in Sweden would probably say that things are getting worse in Sweden. The government is trying to crack down on the media. Whereas an increase in North Korea would probably mean things are getting better. People are daring to stick out their neck, right? So if we have the same numbers, but they mean very different things, that's a problem here. And even if we wanted to get some of these figures from official government sources, not all governments in the world would provide the true data, right? So what we want to know is sometimes unobservable. So in the case with the journalist, what we want to know is really, if a journalist criticizes the government, what's the likelihood that that person would be thrown into jail or harassed? Because that likelihood is 100% almost in North Korea. And that likelihood in an established democracy is almost zero. That's what we want to know. So when we set out to do this, with the 400 indicators, about 200 of them are factual, and they're good. What's in the Constitution, or how many parties actually participated in the elections, and what was the voter turnout, and things like that. But there are also these other, like the journalist questions. So we have about half of them that are trying to measure the unobservable. And for that, we use 5, for each indicator, we use at minimum of 5 country experts per indicator. And these 5 experts are typically academics or analysts with academic degrees, experts on, for example, media in Egypt, or civil society in the Philippines, or political parties in Zambia. And they have a record of being experts there. And 3 out of the 5 should be from the country they code. So it's not white men in their 40s who decide how democratic Egypt is, right? It's a maximum of 2 there, right? And then the 3 others, at the minimum, are Egyptians. And then we aggregate those scores into point estimates. So in the end, this is producing a data set of about 20 million data on democracy. Just to give you an idea of the proportions, Polity, that other CIA-funded thing, that used to be the largest one. It has 275,000 data point on democracy. So it's a little bit different. So today we have had funding to do this for 174 countries. We finished that, and 88 or 89 are online now, 120 as was mentioned at the end of the month. We have worked with over 2,800 country experts across the world from 174 countries now, and we have 15.5 million data points as of now. It's a big collaboration involving lots of people. We have 4 leaders, principal investigators, a lot of project managers, scholars who are experts, international leading experts on different aspects of democracy, like the legislature for Steve Fish, or Alan Hicken on political parties, but also on Southeast Asia and so on. But the key roles are really down here with the V-Dem Institute, where we have the coordinating people and all that, and then regional managers, country coordinators, and country experts who are all these are from the region or from the country that they are responsible for and helping us with. And we have one representative in the room, Dr. Aza, colleague, that we're very grateful to be working with. And here's just a visual of 169 countries of the country experts, and that they come from all these countries. So it's a really diverse crowd of collaborators that participate in this. And the funding sources, many of them, I have to show that. So, before I go into this, are there any questions regarding the V-Dem goals and the approach, the way we go about creating this database? Nobody dares to stick out their neck. Okay. Right. So remember, we have been studying all these important issues and the relationship to democracy. And of course, we study democracy sometimes as what we call the dependent variable, the outcome, right? Thinking that democracy is a valuable thing in itself. To be free to choose your political leaders, to be free to speak your mind, to be free to participate in debate and all those issues, that those are intrinsic values in itself. And then there's the other part of the equation, which is, well, is democracy then good for something as well? Beyond that, right? Does it improve human health or quality of life? Does it lead to less civil war or less interstate war? Does it reduce ethnic conflict? And does it produce more gender equality? Things like that. So these are things that people are concerned with. So here's an example of 50 years of research have been trying to look at these relationships. They've been using this measure of democracy, most of them. That's the Polity 4 measure. And, for example, have been saying that, there were 3 waves of democracy. That's a famous Samuel Huntington, 1991, big statement, 3 waves of democracy or democratization. The first one being after or in conjunction with World War I, increase in democracy here. And then 20s and 30s and World War II. And then after World War II, increasing democracy again. Then a slide down. After independence, many countries in Africa and Asia became military regimes and so on, or single-party dictatorships. And then here, 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, and a surge of democratization in many countries. It started a little bit earlier in Latin America, in the late 70s and early 80s. But for the big push came in after 1989. So 3 waves. This is V-Dem's measure of electoral democracy. So it should be similar to the polity, because polity claims to measure electoral democracy. Can you see here, well, maybe a little wave of first wave of democratization, but very low level in comparison, you can see here. Well, how is that? Well, one thing is that we measure what we want to measure. We measure all aspects of electoral democracy, whereas polity only measures a very narrow, thin slice. And if you remember the example with Sweden becoming a perfect democracy back here in 1917, so it was part of that wave, but women didn't have the right to vote. Right? So that gives you an idea of the sort of that narrowness. So when we measure all of what electoral democracy is, then it's at a much, much lower level in the world, and the increase or the wave of democratization is very small. Now, and you can see the other aspects of democracy, egalitarian, participatory democracy, liberal democracy, deliberative democracy, they don't move almost at all in that first wave. What's the other reason? Well, we measure with experts across the world, and then colonies are not excluded. We asked coders to code back in time, and we collect data back in time also before independence, right? This measure here, you know, relatively high levels of democracy in the world, well, that's only for the independent states, right? Democracy wasn't that good in the colonies, right? Typically, there was a legislative council, and there was a governor or another form of executive that had some local power of legislation and taxation and so on. But it wasn't very democratic, to put it the least, right? So when you include colonies then and look at the entire world and be less sort of in a colonial mind, if you want, then democracy is at much, much lower level. The second wave is also much more tempered here. And then with the third wave, there is an increase, but still at a much lower level of democracy in the world than with polity, because we are more demanding. And you can see the other aspects of democracy have increased a little bit, but much, much less. So what we have a lot is electoral democracy in the world, but a lot of the other potential values, that egalitarian values, deliberative values, and so on, still are not developed very much. This is Africa, but sorry, sub-Saharan Africa, just to illustrate this for the enormous surge in electoral democracy after 1989 there, and some movement when it comes to the deliberative aspects of democracy, but egalitarian, the red one here, almost nothing changes with the big surge of democratization. And we've never been able to see this before because there were no measures of these things, only a measure of electoral democracy. Now we have, we think, a better measure of electoral democracy, but also these. And if you look at North Africa, this region in comparison to other regions, this is a little hard to read if you're in the back of the room. You can also see that within sort of Africa writ large, there are huge variations of what's happened over time and also where we are today. So this is sort of the average here, but you can see North Africa is very low, West Africa is much higher, and Southern Africa much higher. Central Africa is almost as low in general as North Africa, and East Africa is somewhere in between. So if you start to look at the different regions in Africa, there is huge variation here. But another interesting thing is that when we start measuring electoral democracy and also the other aspects of democracy, even the old established democracies are not perfect, right? So here's the United States. And if we look at here, starting from 1940, so around 1950 here, sorry, this starts from 1950, the time scale is that. You can see that it's on sort of, this scale runs from 0 to 1, so 1 would be perfect. And it's like at 0.65. So about 2/3 Democrat, fully Democrat. And this is just the electoral aspect. Because before the civil rights movements in the 60s, and inclusion of blacks and removal of lots of minorities that were pushed outside of democracy, and women to some extent too. And it's still not perfect, even in the electoral dimension, right? And when you start to look at things like participatory democracy, it's pretty crappy, if I'm allowed to use that word, in the United States. And so it is in Sweden. Participatory democracy is not very developed in Sweden. So this is Sweden. We're not perfect either, right? And there has been a development over the 1920s. So here is when we became perfect democracy according to polity, and according to V-Dem, it's more or less only half. And there are Canada and Africa. There are other aspects of this that you can show with the difference with polity. So this is the polity measure of democracy, the one that everybody has been using, right? For Zimbabwe during white minority rule, right? 5% of the population. And it was pretty good according to them. And the same in Namibia and other places. Here's Egypt. So this is polity. The polity measure here around independence, and polity starts at independence only. And the V-Dem measure starts earlier. And this, this red line is our measure of electoral democracy compared to polity. And here is sort of the Arab Spring and then a little dip at the end. Very big differences in these historical periods. Again, also in Egypt, according to Varieties of Democracy, participatory democracy, and egalitarian aspects of democracy. The socioeconomic, health, and education equality that makes it possible for everybody to participate to the same extent. Those are the areas with biggest problems. Although nothing goes very high here at all with that. So I thought it would be a little fun to look at Egypt, wasn't it? Does it matter? Well, I think sort of intuitively, when you see the difference between the polity measure and also Freedom House and these much thicker, broader measures that are also based on assessment of thousands of experts from the countries around the world, makes it intuitive that if we start using V-Dem measures of democracy, then results will be different. Let me give you a couple of sort of scientifically based examples of this. So take global health, because we care about global health, right? These are things that we care about. For example, so we took some indicators from the World Development Indicators, you know, standard measures, life expectancy at birth, infant mortality, and public health expenditure. And started to look at, from the electoral democracy and egalitarian democracy, the different components of those, and see if some of them have different relationship to democracy. Because there's a big literature, I don't know if you're aware of it, but there's a pretty big literature that claims that democracy has no effect on health and human health and livelihood. There's no difference between autocracies and democracies and so on. So in terms of these issues shouldn't matter. And our intuition has been that's maybe because you use these measures that are very thin and aggregated at a high level. So we start to look at different aspects, free and fairness of elections with these indicators, whether there's really a multi-party system or not, sort of part of the electoral, and the liberal aspects of civil liberties with some property rights and freedom from torture. And then this equality aspect of egalitarian democracy, if political power is distributed according to different groups, and judicial control, so that this idea that rule of law is very important as a basic feature. So we ran all these regressions. I'm not going to go through this, but this just shows we have done this time series with fixed effects, so it's only measuring changes within countries over time. The only thing I will point out is that free and fairness of elections is, so it's red, it means it has significant effect. And multi-party control for two of the outcomes, life expectancy and infant mortality. Equality across all outcomes have significant effects. Civil liberties, only for one, not so much. Judicial control, not so much. And then there's some controls. What does this mean substantially? So substantially, what we also show in those regressions is it matters differently for rich countries and poor countries, which is what we would expect, right? Infant mortality is not so much of a problem in countries with high GDP per capita and very developed economies and infrastructures and all that, right? It's much more a problem in a poor country. And it matters for people, of course. If your children die close to birth, it matters. So in poor countries, if you go from unfree to free elections, so completely fraudulent to clean elections, it is associated with reducing infant mortality from 110 per 1,000 live births down to 90. That's a big shift, right? And this is within countries over time changes only. And it's, for rich countries, it doesn't matter much, but for poor countries, it matters, which is sort of our intuition, right? If the leaders are really dependent on our votes, and we care about things like health and infant mortality, we don't like to see our children die, then they should have to do something about it when they're in office, right? Otherwise, we'll throw them out, throw the rascals out, right? And so it's within, but if you hold fraudulent elections, then our votes don't count. It doesn't matter. And then they can sit in office and they don't have to do anything about infant mortality ever, right? Because they're going to win in the next election no matter what, right? So this makes sense. And it's exactly what we would want, from democratic theories, things to show. And the same with life expectancy, right? So whether it's a so I showed the other one that was consistent, multi-party, you really have a multi-party system. So people have a choice, right? If you have one party, there's no choice. If you have two, well, not so much, right? It's one or two, blah, blah, blah. But if you have several parties, no party bans and all these, and it's free, then you have more choice, so people can, select better leaders, right? And the same here, if you go sort of from very low levels on that up to the high levels of that, then you increase life expectancy with almost 10 years. That matters, right? 10 years on average, right? Means for most people is 15, 20 years. Yeah, you want me to stop?
No, I want to argue.
Okay, you want to argue with me? Please.
I think, you said initially after you stopped, you wanted to get a question. That graph is, I think, mixing correlation with causality. You're mixing correlation with causality because if you look at what would not be considered democratic states, most predominantly Singapore, Taiwan, China, etc., they did incredibly well in terms of reducing infant mortality, improving life expectancy, all the measures that you can take. So if you were to isolate that group of countries and look at them, you would have a very different perspective on the multi-party control issue in relation to health and infant mortality reduction. And in fact, even in places like Latin America, you would find that the Pinochet regime, which is nobody's image of a democratic regime by any stretch of the imagination, did quite well on those indicators compared to eminently democratic but not particularly successful regimes like, let's say, the regime of Sadiq al-Mahdi in Sudan, coming with popular elections and so on and removed by the military afterwards. So that by aggregating numbers, we are really looking at general correlations but not causalities. So would you comment on that, please?
Yes, and there are two parts of that comment. So one, let me first address the country's argument. Yes, that's true. It's true with the China, it's true with the Singapore. But I can give you equally many examples of dictatorships that have been terrible. Equatorial Guinea, DRC, Republic of Congo, we can go down the list, right? So one or two sort of, or individual country examples, individual times and periods doesn't necessarily help in understanding what the general relationship is. It's also the case that there are many countries in the sample who have democratized and done very well in reducing infant mortality and improving life expectancy and so on. So here's where the debate has been. Now, individual country examples, right, can be informative and very important to study. but it's important to know where they are in relation to a global, or if you like, universal trend, right? This is the universal one. If we include all countries, 174, okay? No microstates in the Pacific, not Liechtenstein and Vatican City and so on. But 174 countries in the world, from 1900 to 2012, 2014 for a couple of countries, right? Then this is the relationship you see. Now, it's not based on correlation only. So, basically what the analysis do is to look at the free and fair election, the status of the free and fair election. Then 5 years later, what's the level of infant mortality? And then it looks at that for each year. So it's the infant mortality measure and the life expectancy measure are always measured after the level here. So that temporal distance is one way to try and say, okay, so this be not only correlation, but a causation. If they both move up, but this one moves first and then this moves up, then that's an indication that there is a relationship that's more than just a statistical correlation. And it's with fixed effects, so it doesn't compare countries, it compares within countries over time. And then compares those differences over time between countries. So I will totally agree that this doesn't prove, it's not, and in social science, we try to be very careful with saying that we never prove anything. The best we can do is really refute things. And then we can have theories that get support from evidence, but that doesn't mean they are proven. It just means they are not yet disproven. So that's a sort of, I would be perfectly fine with that. I'm very Popperian in that sense. So it's basically, I guess, this analysis is more in relation to the existing scholarship that says there's no relationship, right? And where this indicates that there is a relationship in the expected direction, right?
You see, I mean, I think I've been very involved with this, not as rigorously as you have, obviously, but over a number of years. It does make a difference where the start position is. So, I mean, comparing what's happening in as you rightly showed, in the rich countries is not the same as the developing countries. Among the developing countries, there's also a matter of size. I mean, I can't just compare China with Equatorial Guinea. China has lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in the world. But there have been many studies that have tried to compare regions within China and China as a whole to regions within India and India as a whole, where in fact you have a much more democratic India, a much less democratic China, and yet variations exist. Now, the most interesting work in that area was done by Amartya Sen, where he showed that Kerala in India does as well, if not better, than China with democratic elections, although with a left-wing government. Then you have like most of the regions in China, and then you have the rest of the regions in India coming sort of afterwards in performance. But then at the end of that, as I argued with Amartya, I said, so what does that tell you about causality? I mean, India has fair elections, more or less free and fair elections, more or less, certainly compared to many other developing countries, they do. Certainly compared to China, which makes no pretense at that. And the sizes of the countries are quite large, and they have, therefore, more or less, you're controlling that group of regions. I mean, regions, 50 to 100 million people per region is not, per state is not small. I think this is a very rich terrain to do additional research and try to bring out all the component parts and spread them out and analyze them, because I think the complexity of the relations between the variables are probably greater than can be summed up in a two-dimensional graph.
Oh yeah, I would fully agree with that. We always, I think this speaks to a more sort of general issue also in social science. We are always torn between, on the one hand, the need for in terms of policy making, even if we only discuss one country, we need to be able to provide some general advice and seek for general relationships that can be useful in many situations. And then at the same time, if you look closely at things, everything seems to be unique. And individual situations need a little bit of tweaking or understanding of additional factors and so on. And we can't all the time, at the same time, look at all the details down here and see every little piece of grass in the big field, right? And then at the same time be like the eagle above and understand the contours of the field and that field's relation to other fields and so on. We have to, we have to have people who do sort of look at the grass, but we also need eagles to look at the big picture. And what's really important, which I think you also point out, and I'm grateful for that comment, is that when looking at the grass, but also when looking at the big picture from the eagle perspective, that we are careful with what we are able to say, and hedge it with sort of the limitations of that perspective. Yes. So, I had another example prepared for you, but I see we are running out of time. So, I don't know what you want us to do at this point. We should take more questions.
Why don't you go through the example?
Okay, I'll try and go through that. One thing that's often discussed, especially in emerging democracies, is parties and party institutionalization. Parties we often think of as the very important aspect of an electoral democracy, even electoral, but also as vehicles for furthering egalitarian aspects or participatory aspects and so on. And parties, after all, are the ones we vote for, and their leaders are the ones we put in office. They have many characteristics, and there's been very little, almost nothing, in terms of comparable data on parties. Comparable across time, but between countries. So there are many different things with parties. Here I pulled out a couple of them. Party organization, for example, the blue line here, that's been increasing on a global scale, as you can see, from 1900 here to 2012, and is at the top and used to be almost at the bottom. This is about whether the parties have organizations that reach to all regions of a country. So they have local offices and representatives, so people can actually talk to them, right? Not only an office in the capital and that's it, right? So that they are national organizations. So that's been a very strong development globally over this period. Whereas you can see some other things here that have not improved very much over time. Party linkages. Party linkages is a measure of whether, when parties relate to voters, are they more clientelistic, trying to buy votes for personal goods, hands out cash, a bag of rice, mattresses, cloth, things like that, or local goods like, we'll build a well make sure you get a well in this village if all of you vote for me. Or if they have general policy for the country. Education, trying to win votes by saying, okay, we want education for all, and we want to do this with education. Policy-based things. And then this is a very important indicator whether the legislature invests in practice. If the executive is involved in corruption, stealing, illicit behavior, breaches the Constitution, whatever, does the legislature actually investigate what happened and issue a report about it at a minimum that's open and transparent and honest? Do they fulfill their role, which is typical role in a democracy? The legislature holds the executive to account, right? Executive accountability. Do they do that? Well, you can see that it's been pretty bad here, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s globally. And then with the democratization, late 80s and 90s, it went up, but it's still not doing so well. Regionally, it varies a lot, right? So here you have Western Europe and North Africa. The blue line is Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And this is the party institutionalization index. So you take several of these indicators and put to an index together. You can see that Sub-Saharan Africa used to be the worst, and this is, of course, colonial times. Then with independence, it got a little better, but then a little worse again, and then up a little bit, but not so much. And here's North Africa, approximately the same. You have the Arab Spring spike here, but then it goes down again after that. But here's the thing, that when it comes to critical things like the party linkages, are parties programmatic, trying to win votes on policy issues that concern the entire population, or are they handing out clientelistic goods and trying to buy with local things, very parochial? Why that is important is because if I buy your vote, if I give you a little sum of Egyptian pounds, or I give you a bag of rice or something in a local village, and you promise to vote for me and make your entire family vote for me, then I can go to office and I don't have to do anything, right? Because I buy your votes. Then I can sit in office, I can be corrupt, I can do illegal things, I can vote for whatever policies, it doesn't matter because I'm buying the votes. So it's no democratic accountability. Right? Then you don't get the life expectancy improvements and the healthcare improvements and those kinds of things. North Africa has been doing worse on this for a long time. And here's Arab Spring again, but then it's falling down after that, I can tell you. And here's Sub-Saharan Africa. So both North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa have, on average, the lowest degree of parties that actually try to convince people on policy, on programs for the people. Whereas Asia, even Asia and Latin America and them are doing much better, even if, and this is, the gray one is the global mean. So they are at the mean or a little bit above. And then you have the old established democracies where parties have developed for a long time. That's a big difference. And I think some of the reasons why we see some democracies not performing as well as they should do. So let me stop on that note before we're running too much out of time and say thank you very much for inviting me to come here and speak about the V-Dem project. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to come back in the future.
Professor, if you would be willing to take one or two questions, I think we can do that.
Of course.
I believe I shouldn't sort of monopolize the conversation, especially since we have many distinguished people in the audience who may have a question. But I do have one question for you that I would very much hope that could be part of our future work together. And this is to go more in depth in trying to understand the positives and negatives of party politics. In the United States today, polarized partisanship has twice closed down the United States government in 20 years, which is hardly a measure of successful democracy by any sort of indicator. And yet, in Egypt, we have a major problem with the non-religious parties really not being able to kind of get their act together and play a major role on the political scene. so these would appear to me like two extremes, and it would be very interesting to be able to go through various countries and see how you cope with it. The amazing thing in Egypt, which is probably not captured by anything that V-Dem does today, is this enormous outpouring of people power that we have witnessed on a scale that I and my colleagues who have lived through this are still, in awe of seeing tens of millions of people calmly, without anything, just coming out to the street and saying, no, we don't accept this. Now, that's got to be a form of democracy, but as far as I can see, it's not captured. And we need to think about that, because it did bring down two governments in less than 4 years. So we need to think about that. So that in some ways could be seen as a failure of the political parties, that the people actually just went out on their own. And in another, it could be seen as precursor to something else. I don't know, but I think we have a question here that I believe could be very interesting, researchable question, and I wanted to put that question to you.
Absolutely. And there is so much. Among these 400 indicators, there are several that captures the outpouring of people in the streets, and if you like, an aspect of people's power and participatory aspects of democracy. But it also shows, if I were able to pull it up here, but you can see Egypt is included at least from the end of this month in the online graphing. You'll be able to go online and look at this for Egypt. And then we have the data also for 2013 and 14 there. A lot of these indicators for whether real freedom of movement, freedom of association, freedom of speech, and so on, whether they really exist on the ground. Of course, with the revolutions, they spike. Right? It goes up enormously. And so that's also what showed, to some extent, when you aggregate many indicators up to an index, and some of them move up and others are constant or not moving as much. But for electoral democracy and also for participatory and so on for Egypt, at the end, in these graphs, the very end is 2012. So it was that spike up, right? And you can see that for North Africa in this graph, there's that spike, and then it ends in 2012. Now, from the end of March, we will have the data available for 2013 and 14, and then for many countries, of course, in the MENA region, it went down. So some of it shows, if we start to look at the full breadth of all the indicators. But I'm sure, even if we have tried to measure as much as possible, I'm sure there are aspects that we haven't done, right? I mean, there's in principle an infinite number of indicators you could have. We have tried to do more, and we're doing a lot more than anybody has ever done before. But that doesn't mean it's perfect, of course. We've always said that we should be able to sort of develop and expand this. On the other thing with the parties, I was thinking if I had one of the slides, I often keep a bunch of reserved slides if questions come up. But for example, on the first part here with the United States versus Egypt, there's one indicator for party cohesion. It's very important, cohesion in the legislature, right? Do representatives from the same party, do they vote the same way, right? And from one democratic tradition, it's very important they do that, right? Because if you vote for a party, and then members of that party vote different ways in the legislature, what are you going to do? Should I vote for that party again, or should I vote for a different party? What do I get when I vote for that party? Right? So in the United States, of course, that indicator is very low because the members of Congress, they vote the way they want themselves, and there's no party cohesion, very little. Right? That's one of the Americans from the liberal tradition, they think that's great. Right? most other democratic traditions think that is not good. So in our measures, except for the liberal aspect, then the party cohesion, the lack of party cohesion in a country like the United States draws down, and it's a problem from a democratic point of view. One of the areas where it's obviously not a perfect democracy, and nobody except a few people think that is a perfect democracy, has ever thought so. Yeah, it has many problems.
Thank you, Professor Lindberg, for an interesting presentation of what V-Dem is. Now I seem to understand more what you're doing and what you aim for. It seems to be similar to a certain extent to what Freedom House is doing, but I don't think you do what Freedom House does by pointing out to countries or societies who are not democratic. A second point I'd like to make is that you have presented to us in a very complete way the indicators and the measurements of components of democracy. What about the conditions necessary and sufficient to have a democratic system? What I find very refreshing in your ideas is that there is not one single model for democracy, and that I understand from that, and this is what I believe, that democracy should be a number of principles, but that the system itself does not have to be a Westminster-like system or whatever, but something adapted to the needs and the possibility of society. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for the positive review. This is exactly what we've been trying or hoping to be able to achieve with doing this. Getting away from the idea that democracy is one thing or has to look one way, whether it's the Westminster system or is the US type separation of powers, right? I mean, organizations like USAID, they like to talk about support for democracy, singular. And that means support for American type democracy, right? And there's this famous Italian political science professor who was then also active in the US, and he was very cantankerous. Giovanni Sartori. If you haven't read Giovanni Sartori, please go ahead and do. He's very funny because he's so cantankerous. But he said, American democracy works not thanks to their constitution, but despite it. And it only works because Americans want it to work, right? So, and there's been lots of follow-up in terms of academic analysis, sort of giving more and more evidence to that fact that type of constitutional design doesn't really work well other places for some, and we don't know why it, well, you can debate whether it works in the United States, I'm not so sure. But and the recognition that the established democracies are different, the new democracies are also different. The democracy in South Africa is and is going to be different from democracy in Sweden, and that's okay. Right? There's some founding principles and ideas, but you can realize it in different ways. And in realizing it, you can emphasize different core values. You can be more egalitarian, or you can be more liberal. And you can debate which way you want to go. Now that we democratize, what are the things that we want to emphasize? How do we view what's important in a democracy? Those have been debates everywhere, and it should be debates. And what we're trying to do is to make it possible to see all those different aspects. The preconditions or the requisites is only something we've just put the data together. So, but that's some of the researchers involved here, and I believe many more will get along or come in. That's now something we have to reevaluate. That's something that's been going on since Lipset in the 1950s about the social requisites and economic requisites for democracy. And The answer is we don't know, because now we have new democracy measures, and it may differ also. It may also be not only socioeconomic, it may differ also with the land size, of course, or population size. But it may also differ in terms of which sort of variety of democracy you want to be. If you want to be more of an egalitarian democracy, maybe there are other requisites than if you're okay with the liberal US-style democracy. So, yes, that's exciting, and an exciting research agenda ahead that I encourage as many people as possible to get involved with.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask a question with regards, as an end user, for the information that you've got online. Would it be possible for me to compare your findings in different manners so that it wouldn't just be country by country or region by region, but for example, I could compare democratic levels in monarchies, I could compare democratic levels in countries of a certain given population, or those who have undergone a revolution, or those sort of factors. Can I also do that comparison with the information that you have?
Definitely. Some of the things you mentioned, we already have in the data. So, for example, there is one very detailed indicator on how the executive came into office, whether it came into office with a military coup, so it's a military regime, right? Or it's an elected monarch, or it's a hereditary monarch. Elected monarchs exist, a few places. We had it in Sweden for a long time. Yeah. Actually, I have an ancestor in the 17th century who was part of the sort of selectorate who selected our king and unseated the king. Unseated one and then selected a brother. I don't know if that made much of a difference. But anyway, so yes. Some of the things you may not find in the data, for example, we don't have a specific indicator for whether, it's been a sort of popular revolution or not. And that's a tricky thing to deal with also historically. What's a popular on different kinds of revolutions, right? And but you can add that if you want. So right now, all the data for these 88, 89 countries are available online. At the end of this month, 120. Then on our website, there's an online graphing tool. There are actually a couple of them. But there's, in principle, one for graphing one single country. I want to look at Egypt and all different indicators, or many different indicators, indices. And there's one where you want to compare countries. So I want to look at one set of, or an indicator or an index, compare many countries, compare Egypt with all the other MENA countries. So there you can sort of get a descriptive analysis done automatically. You just, select and then click graph, and you get the graph, and you can download it and everything. Now, if you want to get the original data and do your own analysis in a statistical software or something, it will be available at the end of this year, in December. Then all the 174 countries, all indicators, all years. And then you can analyze it, and then, of course, you can add variables and so on. Online, we also have a few indicators that you can. So we have created a few categories. We've used the OECD classification, for example, of different countries, and we've also used the. So we have, you have the least developed countries and things like that. You have some regional, so you can compare regional averages between each other as a service, right? But if you have statistical software and you can have those skills, then you can download the data at the end of the year, and then so you can add variables and then do whichever analysis you want.
Okay, we really have to bring this to a close, so last question.
we need to create new indicators when we are talking about democracy, like social movements, for example, and the importance of social movements in democracy, like Poland and what's happening through solidarity movements and so on. So it's a very important indication to talk about. I have a question. After 2003, after the American invasion to Iraq, political professors started to talk about a new type of democracy. U.S. invasion to Iraq was a democracy, so a spree democracy. So according to the V-Dem approach, if you want to, if you seek to study the Iraqi case, what's the indicators you will use?
Well, that's what indicators you would use for particular studies is the kind of debates that people have on when they organize the studies. I encourage you, we are starting this partnership now, so there will be many occasions to do this kind of work. I think we've gone a little bit over time, and but I think it was important for all of you to know this enormous project that has no parallel in the world, and with which we have the privilege of being associated and to meet firsthand the person who's leading it and his colleague. I want to say welcome Ali as well. And so I take this occasion asking you to join me in thanking Professor Lindberg.